Good morning. My name is Adnan Morshed. I'm a faculty member here at the Catholic University of America in the School of Architecture and Planning. I teach primarily history and theory of architecture alongside urban design. I'm very privileged to welcome you to our first panel discussion. I'm very excited to say that we have three very exciting papers across that kind of represent a panorama of architectural history. I'm very, very excited about that. I am not Catholic, but I love to say that I'm still working on my conversion. Please, but I'm very excited about learning more about Catholic architecture, in particular about church architecture. This is one of my favorite topics. When I teach about Catholic architecture, I teach about church architecture especially. I'm very interested about Gothic architecture in the late medieval period. Let me try to introduce some of the ideas that I have that can actually explain well some of the papers today that you will be hearing in our panel. If you look at a typical canonical architectural history book, one of the very simple but very powerful arguments presented in this book is that architecture has the ability to represent, calcify, or embody the hopes, aspirations, conditions of societies. But oftentimes, what history books don't emphasize or adequately explain is that some of these exercises, the exercises of this power of architecture occurred in the realm of religion, in the realm of Christianity. So from that angle, first expressions of architecture at the beginning of human history actually took place in the ways built forms sought to articulate people's religious worldviews, their understanding of the afterlife, their understanding of God or gods. For example, from the Mesopotamian ziggurats to the Greek temples, from the Gothic cathedrals to synagogues and mosques, architecture's history took shape actually in the realm of religion. Architecture took shape in the stones, wood, and lights of ecclesiastical buildings, and their clear stories, rose windows, in their soaring spires and walls, and their sculptural programs that sought to be the sort of a book in stone. They conveyed the religious messages to the people. So from this angle, the history of church architecture parallels, I would argue, the history of the Christian faith, of Catholicism, and its intersection with various political ideologies and social contestations, economic trends across the panorama of human history. For example, just to give you one example, the history or an architectural analysis of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, for example, in 12th century France, reveals a host of ideas, from the liturgical imagination of Christianity to the Christian meaning of light as a Christian meaning of light at a particular time in history, from the political context of religious patronage to the history of building construction. And another example is the Chartres Cathedral in France in the 13th century. In 13th century France. In the wake of the massive fire that destroyed the church, Chartres Cathedral exposes how faith and commerce collectively articulated a particular view of Christianity and its intended role in society and politics of the time. So what I'm trying to argue, and I'm sure that the papers that will be presented in this session, they would also argue that the narrative of church architecture is also the history of the complex and non-linear set of ideas, interactions that occurred within Christianity and societies. Church architecture, in other words, narrates the ways Christianity dealt with the anxieties of Reformation and counter-Reformation, political instabilities, papal politics, and most of all, modernity and aesthetic representations and aesthetic discourses. But on the other end of this spectrum, church architecture and analysis of church architecture also reveals the history of man's understanding of light, construction, materiality, and so on. So these are the ideas that percolate, circulate in the papers, the three papers that you'll be hearing today. So before I introduce our panelists today, I would like to talk a little bit about our methodology. For the time constraints, we must limit all the papers to not more than 20 minutes. And I would actually ask the presenters to limit your presentation to 18 minutes so that we have, at the end of the presentation, we have an animated and spirited discussion, because that's the whole point. So we would like to have at least 20-25 minutes toward the end. We will invite all the three speakers here and have it really an exciting discussion on all the three papers. And in fact, there are commonalities, a common thread that kind of runs across all the three papers, because they argue that architecture actually articulated or calcified some of the sentiments, some of the attitudes of the period. So please, I request again that our presenters limit their presentations to 18 minutes, and I will wave at you to signal that you have 30 more seconds. Without further ado, let me present our first presenter, Dr. Michael Deckert, AIA. His paper is entitled Calvinist Religious Architecture and the Venetian Tradition. In fact, he deals with 16th century Venice and how Calvinist architects actually sought to articulate the tensions, anxieties that resulted from the Reformation. So it's really an interesting paper. He's a practicing architect, and I believe he is practicing in Alexandria, Virginia, not far from here, not in Egypt, but here right across the river, not the Egyptian Alexandria, right across from the river. So please welcome Dr. Michael Deckert. By the way, Dr. Michael Deckert actually graduated from Catholic University. He received his PhD from this school, from right here. Please welcome Dr. Michael Deckert.
Thank you, Professor Morshad. I wish to thank the School of Architecture and my colleagues, friends, Professor Martin and Michael Patrick, for putting together this program and for being, shall I say, daring enough to put Calvinist architecture and Venice, two not very, shall we say, ideas that our people would normally assemble. But to jump into this right away, by way of introduction, in the political, religious, and military turmoil of the 16th century, institutions and traditions were created and altered to serve the new structure of Reformation Europe. The rise of religious reform movements opposing the institutional church and papacy searched for new patterns for the design of religious structures and communities. Calvinist architects in the second half of the 16th and early 17th century sought to create new forms of architectural expression reflective of both tradition and of the new alliance between state and church. The Lutherans and Anglicans, at least initially, took over largely medieval Catholic churches, whereas the Calvinists were looking to create new forms better adapted to their concepts of faith and community. The Republic of Venice, with its rich political, religious, social, and architectural legacy spanning 1,000 years, became a model for the Calvinist reform architects. The autonomous and independent Venetian Republic had developed a national church that remained in communion with both Rome and Constantinople, but still remained fiercely independent. The Venetians were pious without being bigoted, politically pragmatic, mercantile, and open to scientific and technical advances. Venice had suffered and survived papal and imperial aggression at the beginning of the 16th century, and began investigating alliances with the Smalcaldic League in Germany, the French, and even the English Protestant crown. Venice became effectively a host to Anabaptist, Lutheran, and Reform leaders and their meetings on their territory, but most importantly to Calvinism and the Italian Spirituali. These gained significant, often numerous adherents among and sympathizers among the Venetian patriciate. The quest for a clearly Calvinist architecture can be found in France, particularly around the court of the Count of Rohan in Brittany. The Calvinist architect-engineers adopted Catholic late medieval forms from their own French national tradition, but also from the Venetian pluralistic religious social architectural design. The reception of Venetian architectural forms by a rising Calvinist mercantile middle class occurred in a religiously embattled France, especially in the period following the St. Bartholomew Days massacre, which marks an important point in architectural history. This presentation seeks to find common elements in Calvinist and Catholic religious building traditions and to differentiate these traditions based upon the religious, ideological, and cultural economic commitments that both created and divided the modern West. The ability to define form and its interaction with belief in a historical context widens the horizons for design and cultural adaptation in an increasingly pluralistic world. The premier exponent of Calvinist architecture is a little-known Savoyard mathematician named Jacques Perret. Numerous authors have acknowledged Perret as a significant architectural theorist from the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Perret is best known for his De fortification et artifice, architecture et perspective de Jacques Perret, gentilhomme savoisien. This is the frontispiece from his work, illustrated with engravings by Thomas Deleu. The volume is referred to in passing by numerous authors, and particularly Helen Rosenau for its radial ideal city plan, at the center of which rises a Mannerist proto-modern skyscraper. Manfredo Tafuri makes passing mention of the Protestant ideological content of the inscriptions framing the plates of Perret's volume. Pierre Lavedan has focused on the city planning aspect of Jacques Perret's work, with particular regard to the planned city of Enrichement done for the Duc de Sully, to serve as a ville refuge for the Huguenots. The scholar, though, who has made the greatest contribution is Patricia Mary Grady, who in 1993 attempted to assemble all the information she could about this architect's particularly published work. She focused primarily on the actual production of the volume and its numerous editions, which came out in 9 versions or 9 editions between 1601 and 1620 in both French and German translations, each modified more or less subtly to conform with the political religious situation at the time of publication. The volume consists of some 22 to 29 pages of engravings and about 11 to 17 accompanying descriptive commentaries. Perret presents a whole series of building typologies, chateaux, churches, residences, agricultural structures, and city plans. The common thread is the creation of a specifically Protestant Huguenot architecture and planning. The architecture is firmly rooted in major Renaissance Italian architectural and military engineering designs, though often filtered through the French Renaissance stylistic characteristics that are exhibited by Jacques-Androuet du Cerceau and Philibert Delorme. Details of Jacques Perret's life are scanty. Balmas discovered that the Duke Emanuele Filiberto, the Duke of Savoy, appointed Jacques Perret as a lecturer of mathematics and geometry at the recently established Jesuit college in Chambéry in 1568. The Perret family was a local bourgeois family that had been ennobled, and his 2 brothers had served as mayors for the city of Chambéry. From his work, We know that he had a rather standard classical education. He refers to the Roman authors Vegetius and Frontinus, both of whom are Roman military architects. And we know that at some point in the 1580s, Jacques Perret became a Protestant Huguenot and was therefore forced to leave Savoy. We know he came into the circle and private court of Catherine de Parthenay. Her years are 1554 to 1631. And the premier Protestant general, the Duc de Rohan, and we know this because on the plates of the volume, there are the coats of arms of these two personages. Catherine de Parthenay's tutor and principal advisor was the great French mathematician François Viette. Catherine de Parthenay's first husband was killed attempting to defend Admiral Coligny during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572. Catherine then remarried the Duc de Rohan, who was from a Breton, and who had fought and died actually in battle against the Catholics. He had fought with Henry III of Navarre. And he had become basically the de facto leader of the Huguenot Protestant cause. Henry II of Rohan, then the son of Catherine de Parthenay, became effectively the leading commander, sort of by inheritance. And he married the daughter of the great minister of Henry IV, the Huguenot Maximilien de Béthune, the famous Duc de Sully. Duc de Sully was in charge of the reconstruction of France after the Civil Wars and the rebuilding of the French national financial system. The volume is dedicated to King Henry IV, and the words are rather interesting. Sire, you are God's chosen vicar on earth and the principal minister of his glory for the just and equitable governance of the community, and for the great and humble to obey and serve according to his commands, which we must obey, and we devoutly pray that you always be under his, God's holy protection. The book never mentions Huguenots or Protestants by name, probably because of the restrictions of the Edict of Nantes, which granted religious freedom to Protestants while recognizing Catholicism as the state religion. The Huguenot character of the volume is largely expressed by inscriptions in French that frame the engraved drawings. 70 of the inscriptions are excerpts from the Psalms as translated by Protestants, and there's a gospel passage from St. Matthew, as well as other instructive epigrams and prayers. The Edict of Nantes was proclaimed by Henry IV in 1598 and is a key document granting Huguenots considerable religious freedom, civil rights, free trade, and equal access to political and administrative posts, including a possession of approximately 100 fortified towns, many of which had standing Huguenot military formations. Now, Jacques Perret, and I have you focus primarily on this church design at the top, never uses the term église or church. He routinely refers to temples, sometimes associated to colleges. This use of the term temples is interesting in that it actually is a term resurrected in large part by Leon Battista Alberti, specifically referring to the Tempio Malatestiano in Rimini that he designed upon the shell of the Church of San Francesco. The Tempio Malatestiano has a strongly Neoplatonic humanistic Renaissance ideological program based upon the belief system of Sigismondo Malatesta, the Duke of Rimini. The alternative use of the term temple is based in a re-evocation of the Jewish tradition and its early Christian communitarian manifestations. With John Calvin's Reformed theology that redirected the design of religious structures from Catholic sacramental sanctuary as the holy place to house the living presence of God, as manifesting itself, in this case, in the Calvinist spiritual communion through an assembly of believers to hear the Word of God. The Protestant Reformation, by and large, inherited former Catholic churches, though largely stripped of iconographic and sculptural cycles that dominated medieval Christianity. Graven images were equated with idolatry, and therefore many radical Protestants pursued a policy of destruction of the figurative arts portraying God and the saints. The result was a quest for a model for a new religious architecture that was compatible with the effective creation of national churches in which the king and ruler was the source of both political and religious authority. Jacques Perret found the new model. The quest for new Protestant architecture may be found in Italy, and more specifically in the Republic of Venice. As we know, Jacques Perret had a first-hand knowledge of Italy. Savoy had always had a cultural character as both French in Chambéry and Italian in Piedmont and Savoy. Savoy was always served as a cultural and commercial conduit between France and Italy. Jacques Perret and the Duc de Rohan, his patron, knew Venice. The Duc de Rohan visited Venice as a 22-year-old and near the end of his life actually served as a Venetian infantry commander for the Republic. And his 3 books, that is the Duc de Rohan's 3 books, were published in Venice, and especially the 1634 volume, which is called De l'intérêt des princes et états de la Christianité. Again, dealing with the issues of Christianity and state authority and the new princes. The few people who have studied Jacques Perret have not noticed that 2 church facade designs presented in the treatise are derivatives of Santa Maria dei Miracoli, a church designed by Pietro Lombardo and built in the period 1481 to 1489. Both schemes present a barrel-vaulted space with a facade reflecting the vault. The lateral small, the designs share a large central rose window at the top of the facade. Lateral small oculi flanking the central rose window appear in Perret's design, while Santa Maria has a constellation of 5 such oculi. So if you can notice the 3-part top, middle, and bottom, and compare them to these schemes. So you have basically the upper rose window, 2 flanking oculi, whereas the Venetian version has the 5. You'll notice that the midsection has 5 bays. In the Northern European climate, obviously there was a greater need for light, as you see in the Gothic cathedrals, as compared to, in this case, 5 bays, but with a much smaller Mediterranean-sized openings. And then the base with a centrally located entry. This version has a little bit of a projecting entry, which is better suited, obviously, to a Northern European climate, though the earlier one, that's here, you see it projecting from the front, and then the large centralized space. Now, the organization of the interior space, the facade is obviously clearly derived, but the interior is modified in that the Venetian tends to be a long, unitary, large central volume, ending in the Catholic altar where the living presence of God in the Catholic tradition is located. The Protestant, the Huguenot version, is now modified toward a congregation which is listening to the Word of God. So very different organization. I should also note that Venice does have having been in the Venetian tradition, in the Byzantine tradition rather, also these large single centralized spaces as part of their tradition. So Jacques Perret is emphasizing the assembly or congregation listening to God. Through these design features are clear, but they don't adequately explain Jacques Perret's temples in this congregational use. In Venice, the most important confraternities, or scuole, had their own church as well as a major hall. Perhaps the most dramatic is the Sala del Capitolo of the Scuola Grande di San Rocco. That's this one, whose decoration was ended in the 1570s. It appears that Perret's temple with the college, which appears in one plate of his book, is actually fulfilling the purpose of house of worship and guild hall confraternity in a pattern analogous to Venice, and not far from that of the other guild halls throughout Europe. The next aspect is the city planning one. The next aspect becomes integral to the rise of a new Protestant architecture is the creation and protection of the Huguenot community and congregation from destruction. As it may be surmised that Jacques Perret served as the military architect to the Duc de Rohan because of numerous fortified citadels and the magnificent radial city plan presented in his volume, the most obvious model is Palma Nova, the radial concentric. Please note the radial concentric aspects of this. That's the plate that he shows with, please note, the large, this is the high-rise proto-skyscraper for the French king to be located at the center. And there it is. Let me jump ahead. Oh. I'm afraid somebody left out the Palma Nova. But Palma Nova, which was upon which this is based, is the radial concentric city of the Venetian Republic. It was designed by Giulio Savorgnan and Bonaiuto Lorini with Vincenzo Scamozzi. The famous Brown and Hogenberg image of Palma Nova with the great tower at the center, just for which Jacques Perret adopts the same position for the King's Tower, is actually establishes the high-rise King's Palace at the center. The king is the head of state and church physically, politically, and spiritually, and his palace rests at the center of town. The king is effectively God's vicar at the heart of the city. It's interesting to note that the roof terrace of the king's high-rise palace has an observation deck. In fact, there have been comments that Le Corbusier's roof deck in the roof deck down in the Marseille apartment block was perhaps inspired by this. In any case, Gerhard Eimer has proposed that Perret's largest town plan is a reflection of John Calvin's ideas for a well-ordered Calvinist society. But there's an older medieval French planning tradition, the Bastide, that may also be seen as a precedent for Jacques Perret. The original Bastide of Aigues-Mortes, founded by Louis IX of France. Here's a plan. His crusade port on the Mediterranean is a model for as many as a couple of hundred French medieval 13th century settlements. The Aigues-Mortes model served as a major role in the suppression of the Cathars in southern France, and was often, as the French king sought to unify France, they had a need of creating towns that were loyal, often by transplanting subjects from the Ile de la Cité into areas of heresy and political military rebellion. The policy worked so well that the Cathars and the English-allied nobility of southern and western France built their own lines of defense employing this form, which is basically a gridiron plan, central plaza, usually quite contained. In this case, Aigues-Mortes is only about 330 meters by 550. Probably for a population of about 5,000 to 10,000 people at that time. It should be noted that many of the areas of France that had a strong Cathar presence in the 12th and 13th centuries were to become strong Huguenot areas in the 16th century. In other words, the Ville Refuge is effectively a Bastide model of city planning adapted to the political military exigencies of the late 16th and early 17th century. As already mentioned, the town of Enrichemont of 1608 was built under the Duc de Sully as a ville refuge, as a protective town to protect the Huguenot population. It's attributed to Jacques Perret by Lavedan, though the names actually associated with the town are those of Solomon de Brosse, a military engineer, and Hugues Cosnier, a canal builder. Lavedan reconstructed the plan of Enrichemont based upon actual site conditions. This is the way it actually is. It never was completed because of the assassination of Henry IV. This is the idealized plan. It can be drawn in part from the published work of Perret, and this is how Lavedan interpreted one of Perret's city plan schemes. In any case, the idea was it's an interesting variation of a kind of sort of a radial concentric, but using a gridiron and diagonal streets with the creation of 4 subordinate plazas. So the object was, in the Duc de Sully saw cities as centers for new industries and commerce, and therefore the Calvinist vision of a societal order coinciding with an emerging mercantilist economy. Final comment. Venice and the Venetian Republic, by the time of the 16th century, could claim to be the oldest and best governed and most prosperous republic in the world. The myth of Venice as the oldest, most representative constitutional government with religious tolerance was actually put to the test at the beginning of the 16th century when Venice was attacked by the League of Cambrai. The League was an alliance of Catholic Church and empire led by Pope Julius II. Venice lost much of its Italian possessions. Eventually it regained them. But Venice always had a fascinating relationship with Rome and Constantinople, because until the fall of Constantinople, the Venetian church remained in religious communion with both Constantinople and Rome. The Venetian patriciate then, upon these disasters of the early 16th century, began systematically contacting and developing diplomatic ties with emerging Protestant states in an effort to find a countervailing political and military forces to Spain, the empire, and the papacy. Actually, in this brief sketch is only a preliminary attempt to make one understand that Venice could provide a model, political, religious, and architectural, to Protestant movements like the Huguenots of France, who wanted a religiously independent mercantilist state patterned upon a political religious ideology largely free of papal intervention. Jacques Perret gives us an insight into a new direction in religious expression that is profoundly rooted in a Western cultural tradition. Thank you very much.
That was excellent. We are within our time frame. Thank you, Michael. Our next speakers are Professor Esteban Fernandez Cobian and Professor Eduardo Delgado Orozco. The title of their paper is Looking for a New Tradition, Spanish Religious Architecture Transformations During the 20th Century. Esteban and Eduardo are the faculty at the University of Coruna in Spain. The central argument of their paper sort of takes us into the 20th century. They are essentially arguing that how church architecture in Spain negotiated a range of ideas that emerged with the various political strands in Spain, and especially how church architecture negotiated the problems or the crisis of identity construction in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. So please welcome Esteban and Eduardo.
Thank you. Good morning. We wish that we could speak to you in English. We are from Spain, and maybe some of you will understand our presentation in Spanish. Con esta comunicación solo intentaremos explicar lo que ha sucedido en España durante el siglo XX. Explicar cómo la aspiración a crear una nueva tradición que se adecuara al espíritu de los tiempos en el campo de la arquitectura religiosa a menudo colisionó con la terca realidad física de un territorio fuertemente determinado por la geografía y el clima, y con la obstinada realidad psicológica y cultural de sus habitantes. Para ello nos apoyaremos en algunos ejemplos que nos permitirán aludir a otros tantos temas que turfaron el debate, el intenso debate sobre la construcción del espacio sagrado en la España del siglo XX. Juan Daniel Fullaondo ha sido uno de los críticos que más ha utilizado el surrealismo, entendido aquí como lo absurdo, lo extraño, lo insólito, lo ridículo o lo extravagante, como clave hermenéutica para la comprensión de la arquitectura española de la modernidad.
Juan Daniel Fullaondo was one of the critics that has utilized surrealism as the hermeneutic key to understand the Spanish architecture of modernity.
La fascinación del español por lo onírico, que podría ilustrarse con el inacabado templo expiatorio de la Sagrada Familia de Antonio Gaudí, que acabamos de ver, es heredera de la inmensidad de la meseta castellana y del sol inmisericorde que cae sobre ella, provocando alucinaciones y espejismos, del sentimiento trágico de la vida, que se refleja en las corridas de toros, la fiesta nacional, pero también de un catolicismo formalmente muy arraigado en la sociedad y a menudo mal entendido o simplemente no comprendido en absoluto.
There is a certain Spanish fascination for the oniric, for the dreams, that is inherited from the huge Spanish plain and the sun that falls above it, and that produces hallucinations and that mirrors images, that produces hallucinations and mirages. The sentiment of tragic is reflected in corridas that are also national feasts, but also in a very specific type of Catholicism that is that depends on the society and that cannot be understood without outside the frame of the society.
De hecho, el proverbial anticlericalismo español, el gusto por el requiebro que intenta equilibrar con el humor las amarguras de la vida o la suplantación provisional de la personalidad, tendrían su máxima expresión en el carnaval.
The legendary Spanish anti-clericalism and its taste for balancing the humor with the tragic of life has its expression in the Spanish Carnival.
Este surrealismo, entendido como modus vivendi, se explicita en la literatura, en la pintura o en el cine, desde Francisco de Goya a Salvador Dalí, y también en la arquitectura religiosa.
This surrealism is understood as a modus vivendi and is explained in literature, paintings, and the movies, from Francisco de Goya, Salvador Dalí, and also in religious architecture.
Obsérvese, por ejemplo, el caso del Seminario Conciliar de San Miguel, construido por Víctor Eusa en Pamplona en el momento de excepcional virulencia antirreligiosa que caracterizó la Segunda República Española. Ante la prohibición de levantar cruces en los edificios, Eusa diseñó toda la fachada en forma de cruz, haciéndose eco de un proyecto anterior de Casto Fernández Schock, titulado Templo Rascacielos, la Cruz Soñada.
For example, in this case, seminary in San Miguel was constructed by Victor Eusa in Pamplona and the moment of exceptional anti-religious movement in Spain. And this provision of the building of this type of architecture, he designed the facade in the shape of a cross, referring to a project built before by Fernando Shaw by the name of La Cruz Soñada in 1930.
El surrealismo nos va a permitir conectar los intentos de encontrar una nueva tradición, un camino válido por donde acometer, sin demasiado esfuerzo, una arquitectura religiosa correcta y generalizable, adecuada al espíritu de los tiempos y que pudiera evolucionar con aquel. En la España del siglo XX se pueden rastrear al menos 3 intentos. El recurso ideal a la arquitectura eterna, el recurso al arcaísmo como nuevo punto de partida y el recurso al contexto, entendido como entorno natural y cultural. De las 3 tendencias, la primera es clásica, la segunda moderna y la tercera orgánica. Todas albergan cierto grado de ruptura y se podrían organizar mediante el esquema dialéctico hegeliano, tesis, antítesis y síntesis. Comencemos por el principio.
The surrealism is going to allow us to connect the intention of finding a new tradition, a way of valuing to compile without a lot of effort a religious architecture that is right and generally it brings the spirit of the time, and at the same time, it can evolve. In Spain, it's like, you can see three different types, three different intentions behind it in the 20th century.
The resort to an ideal eternal architecture, resorting to a new architecture, as a new starting point, and the resort to context understood as natural and cultural environment. And among these three tendencies, the first is classical, the second is modern, and the third is organic. And all of them
Bring some sort of
some sort of fracture.
And you can organize them by a dialect of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So we're going to start from the beginning.
Idealismo. Uno de los primeros proyectos de Luis Moya es el llamado Sueño Arquitectónico para una Exaltación Nacional, que nació en las trincheras de la Guerra Civil Española.
One of the first projects by Luis Moya is called Sueño Arquitectónico para una Exaltación Nacional in 1939, and it was born in the Civil War in Spain.
En él se observa una iglesia dedicada a la memoria del héroe desconocido, formalizada mediante una arquitectura de difícil catalogación, tal vez surgida de un sueño febril que mezcla elementos egipcios y romanos con otros absolutamente modernos y que anticipa el movimiento metafísico italiano.
In this, you can see the church is dedicated by to the memory of an unknown hero, formalize an architecture that is very hard to qualify. Maybe it's suggested by a dream, and it's mixing Egyptian elements with Romans and some other that are absolutely modern. And this is anticipating the metaphysic movement, the Italian metaphysics movement.
Esta línea de trabajo no tendrá continuidad en su trayectoria, aunque sí se encontrarán retazos en su producción religiosa posterior.
This line of work is not going to have a very long trajectory, a path, even though you're going to find a little bit pieces in the religious aspect after.
Arquitecto erudito y extraordinariamente dotado, Moya reclamó durante toda su vida unas pautas claras para construir la casa de Dios, pero no las encontró.
A very learned and extremely gifted architect, Moya claimed during his entire life some clear
Choose ways,
different ways to build the house of God, but so he was trying to find these ways, but he wasn't able to find them.
Una arquitectura de este tipo no podía estar al albur de las modas, de los movimientos artísticos, pensaba, al menos de manera absoluta.
This type of architecture could not be at the mercy of the fashion or of artistic movements. This is what he thought, at least not in absolute.
Obviamente, debería poder incorporar los avances tecnológicos, dar respuestas ajustadas a los 1000 problemas que la construcción de los grandes espacios religiosos plantea en cada momento histórico, pero sin dejarse determinar por ellos.
Obviously, this type of architecture should be able to incorporate the technological advancements of the time and respond to the thousands problems that construction of large religious spaces would actually require in every historical moment, but at the same time, it could not be determined by all these issues.
Por ejemplo, Moya combatió la inmediatez constructiva, uno de los presupuestos básicos de la modernidad, contraponiéndola a la buena educación, a la cortesía, que lleva a la arquitectura a ofrecer una cierta variedad de registros según sean las circunstancias.
For instance, Moya advocated against the immediate constructiveness, and he counter-argued it with good education, with politeness, that it with it architecture to offer a variety of circumstances.
El determinismo formal de la técnica moderna no le convencía, y menos aún para la arquitectura religiosa.
The formal determinism of the modern techniques he was not very convinced by it, and he didn't like,
let alone
the religious architecture.
Por eso, en la que tal vez sea su obra maestra, la iglesia de San Agustín, Moya buscará en la forma elíptica una síntesis planimétrica entre el espacio central perfecto y el espacio basilical direccional.
That's why his masterpiece, the Church of San Agustín in Madrid in 1945-59, Moya was looking for an elliptical shape as a synthesis of a central space that would show the basilical directional space.
Y simultáneamente vestirá esa forma con una fachada complejísima que presenta en sociedad el espacio que se ha conseguido crear.
And at the same time, he was gonna dress the facade very complicated. He would present to society a space that was not able to be done before. He would be able to construct a doctrinal body with 6, 7, or 8 churches. Yeah, that would be later.
Bien. Llega así a construir un corpus doctrinal ilustrado con 7 o 8 iglesias, cada vez más depuradas, con el que suplir aquel código que insistentemente reclamó a la Santa Sede y a los obispos españoles.
So he will end up building a doctrinal body illustrated with further 7 or 8 churches that will become every time more simpler and simpler, and that would appeal to the Santa Sede, the sacred, to basically the Catholic authority and the Spanish bishops.
Pero Moya, a pesar de toda su influencia, no consiguió equilibrar la fuerza del espíritu de los tiempos en España. Demasiado intelectual para unos y demasiado aferrado a la tradición para otros, su legado solo sería recogido muchos años después por un discípulo indirecto, Rafael Moneo.
That's why Moya, even though he was a very good influence, he couldn't balance his strength for the spirit of the time in Spain. He was very intellectual for once, and he was very traditional for others, and his legacy was recognized during the years that came after
by one of his disciples, Rafael Moneo.
La imagen que la Catedral de Los Ángeles proyecta en la autopista remite indudablemente a Fernández Shaw.
The image is showing the highway in Fernández Shaw.
Segunda vía, el arcaísmo. Claro que Moneo prefiere vincular su obra a la Basílica de Nuestra Señora de Aránzazu, un edificio que marcó, sin duda, el inicio de una nueva arquitectura española. La modernidad se entendía entonces como arcaísmo, como el grado cero de la cultura desde donde se podría fundamentar una nueva tradición.
So the second way of approaching religious architecture, Catholic architecture, was archaism, and it is obvious that Rafael Moneo, prefers to relate his work to the Basílica de la Nuestra Señora de Arcantazu, which is a building that has marked, obviously, the beginning of a new Spanish architecture. Modernity was understood at that time as an archaic, within an archaic paradigm, and with the 0 degree of culture that could fundament a new tradition.
Aránzazu supuso el inicio de un itinerario iniciático para la arquitectura española, un largo e intenso ejercicio lleno de dramatismo romántico, donde las fuerzas de la naturaleza se fundían con las energías de la violencia artística propias del informalismo abstracto.
The Church of Aranzazu was an initiated path in Spanish architecture. It was a long exercise of romantic drama, where the forces of nature were found in the energies of artistic violence that were specific to the abstract informalism.
Aparentemente, la obra de Aránzazu no tuvo seguidores en España. Decimos aparentemente porque hay una costumbre ridícula, pero muy arraigada, entre los arquitectos españoles de no reconocer paternidad alguna.
This work of Aránzazu didn't have a lot of followers in Spain. That apparently didn't have many, because there's this ridiculous costume of the Spanish architects not recognize their own.
Not recognizing any precedents.
Miguel Fisac, por ejemplo, nunca aludió a Aránzazu para referirse a su arquitectura religiosa. Durante los años 50, este arquitecto provocó una auténtica revolución.
For example, Miguel Fisac, he never said that Aránzazu was one of his religious architecture references. During the 50s, this architect really provoked a revolution.
Una revolución que consistió en prescindir de cualquier imposición formal preestablecida en la arquitectura sagrada para empezar a reflexionar desde cero, de tal manera que la forma de las iglesias sería una consecuencia directa del uso del espacio.
This revolution consisted in is an informal presentation of the sacred architecture to start to reflect from zero, in a way that the churches will be considered a direct path to the use of space.
Inventó así un nuevo concepto, el dinamismo, que desarrolló con sus tres variantes: la convergencia de muros, el dinamismo doble por geometría y color y el muro dinámico.
It was like that he invented a new concept, dynamism. He developed three different variables: the convergence of walls, the dynamism, the double dynamism of geometry and color, and the dynamic wall.
It's time. It's the middle of the communication, but it's time.
Can you summarize the argument, maybe just to conclude the paper?
Si podrías decir algo para poder terminar, para concluir el papel.
It's very difficult. I must see you and a little video. Is possible 40 seconds. Es un vídeo que muestra el absurdo de la arquitectura religiosa contemporánea en España. Era el final de mi argumentación, pero bueno.
It's a video that shows how absurd contemporary Spanish Catholic architecture is nowadays, and that was supposed to be the final conclusion of the presentation.
Esta iglesia, autoconstruida con materiales de desecho por un antiguo monje agricultor, es una de las dos únicas obras que se ha expuesto en el MoMA neoyorquino en 2006.
This church that was built with recycled materials was put together by a monk and was one of the only two Spanish pieces that was on display at MoMA for an exhibition
2006.
in 2006.
Justo Gallego construye una catedral con sus propias manos desde hace 40 años, sin apoyo oficial de ningún tipo.
El proyecto no hay nada. Yo soy labrador. Lo he resuelto todo. Las dimensiones me parece que son de largo 50, de altura a la cúpula 35 y las dos torres unos 60. Y lo tiran todo.
Pocos creyeron en él.
Que ni abrumo yo lo que he conseguido, por la constancia de un ideal.
Hoy se le conoce en todo el mundo. Su obra se ha expuesto en el MoMA de Nueva York y ahora protagoniza el spot de una conocida marca de refrescos. ¿No es maravilloso? El ser humano es imprevisible.
¿A que sí?
Es la era Aquarius.
Lo más interesante venía después, pero bueno.
Thank you, Professor Esteban Fernandez Cobian, for taking care to maintain time. I really appreciate it. I'm sure that we'll have more opportunities to have some discussions during the Q&A at the end of the papers. Our final speaker is Professor Zoran Vukozawi. Did I say it right? Okay, I will let him speak his surname because it's really difficult for me to pronounce. His paper is entitled Catholicism at the Eastern Border of Europe, Works in Post-Communist Countries. Basically, his paper argues that the church architecture in Eastern Europe found itself in a rather complicated and uncomfortable position to negotiate the responsibilities of constructing identities in the wake of the fall of communism. So please welcome Professor Zoran, who teaches, who's an assistant professor at the Budapest University of Technology and Economics.
Dear Chairman, dear audience. First of all, I would like to show you the main elements of the presentation. I would like to show some examples from the start of the 20th century, then some unique examples from the communist era, and on the end, some examples from the end of the 20th century, which are showing showing us really different solutions for finding the new possibilities and models. So this will be the session. Middle Eastern Europe is on the historical ridge of Catholicism. In the history of the island, now consisting of Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, the presence of Catholicism is dominant. For centuries, these most eastern countries of the Roman Catholic Church have been the combatants of faith located in the close vicinity of Orthodoxy and Muslim states. The constructing activity of the Church was broken even in the changing state formations. In the 20th century, the international modern architecture of Europe has been enriched with outstanding compositions of the church architecture of these countries. The progressive architectural style animated the new functional approach of the Catholic Reform. Progressive architectural style animated movement as well. The composition of churches followed the functional arrangement of early Christian secular space, even between the two world wars. The dynamically developing church employed the most well-known architects in this way. The national styles could also appear besides modernism. The romantic buildings emerging from the secession and using traditional vernacular forms. The next few buildings are talking about this topic. The monastery church of Budapest Pasaréd is created by simple forms. The architect, Gyula Rimanóczy, designed it in the modernist style near to the Romanticism that was the typical period of the period's Italian architecture. Also the porch with the columns and the arched inner span of the gate are historical references, just as the beamed ceiling quoting the traditional sunk-paneled ceilings. The next church in Slovakia, Megyeszai Church in Ráros-Mujad, uses central spaces form in its organic space formation, creates a special communal space. The vernacular form treasury is appearing not only in relation of decoration, but also in the arch line of the layout and the form of the tower. The church is special for the cover of the central space, where the period's technical achievement is used in the sin-reinforced concrete cupola, forming vegetal petals. However, this enrichment in architecture was followed by the extreme decline after the end of the Second World War. In the countries of Eastern Bloc, getting under the influence of the Soviet Union, church construction activity approached zero, nearly zero. It was more shocking than the wartime damages and socialization that in the socialist era, a church could only be built at the site of a demolished former church. The construction of a new building was only possible as the representative manifestation of the communist state. In the once prosperous East European Catholic countries, ideological oppression and even physical pogrom reigned for 40 years. In this atheist dictatorship, Christianity was considered as something to be concealed. During the socialist communist dictatorship, sacral buildings could be only built under very strict control. With achieving a political stabilization, the construction of these certain buildings became possible as a favor toward people. The satisfaction of social needs was intended to consolidate the counterbalance of democratic movements. We can see some images of these rebels. Uprising started in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But in both cases, they were suppressed by the troops of the Warsaw Pact, marching in more or less Soviet tanks, getting to these countries. The Hungarian state, in order to represent its social indulgence, commissioned László Csaba with the design of a new church to the place of a small church that had been demolished for the sake of an industrial investment. Expressive formation and complex program of related arts show the era's architectural approach, which doesn't stand opportunism. The expressive triangular formation, the unique use of light has made this building be an outstanding creation. The crematorium near Bratislava in Slovakia, designed by Milucki, is of the same high standard and can be recognized as the gem of modern architecture. On the edge of the woods, the long-running parallel walls are adapted to the hillside. Between them, the space covering create the architectural space. Mortar is formed, which is wide open to the side of woods by huge glass windows. In this way, the mystery of farewell becomes the part of the landscape. Political changes have started with the election of John Paul II as Pope in 1978. Karol Józef Wojtyła, coming from the communist Poland, preached for peace, and his consistent forgiving attitude made more permissive not only the leaders of his own nation, but the political leaders of Czechoslovakia and Hungary as well. The Church of the Workers' Town Nova Huta, next to Krakow, had been being built for decades before it was consecrated in 1977. But the building has an organic layout, and its ceiling of an enormous span is held by the steel loading bearing structures produced by the steel factory and is covered with timber cladding. The arch line of the walls tries to set itself free from the bleak purity of buildings constructed from prefabricated panels. An obvious relationship can be found between this building and the magnificent work of Corbusier in Ronchamp. In the 80s, the building activity of the church slowly became tolerated, but the real breakthrough was the fall of the socialist bloc and the start of democratic changes. Beyond financial rehabilitation, the new freedom of soul was much more important. The gates of churches could be wide opened again. The house of God were crowded for masses. The religious communities of the extensive building estates pulled up during socialism intended to build churches for their own, and the worker colonies of the industrial areas aspired to a home as well. After 1989, several churches were built trying to compensate for the decades-long backlog. The construction related to political changes were established in areas where the ease from strong political pressure had resulted in a very fast counter-reaction. In several industrial towns that had been settled under socialism, the churches appeared nearly simultaneously to the changes. The Catholic Church of the internationally known, well-known architect Imre Makovec has been built on the skirts of the concrete Plattenbau of Paks. Hungarian organic architecture is inspired by ancient vernacular architecture. The composition seems like something before Christianity, carrying the vernacular religion of the 1,000-year-old Christian state and determining a place within the world of the turn of the millennium at the same time. A building organism was born from the anthropomorphic signs. The composition forms a heart of a shape, a heart shape. The timber structure rise from the layout for the heart-shaped skylight of the ridge, just like the two angels who accompany Christ turn to the light with their wings. Makovec has balanced the uncertain period of political changes and social transition with the conscious use of the specific language of forms. The treasure of Hungarian vernacular forms becomes the embodiment of religious tradition, of new tradition. The vernacular tradition of the previous presented church's organic layout arrangement is seeking for the architectural space of the turn of the millennium in terms of new formal approaches. This search for style is typical of that churches too, where the historic forms and details are adopted more directly. A church in Budapest, a university church in Budapest, in the near vicinity of university and office buildings, lays on the banks of the river Danube. The main sacral space is determined by a cupola with flat arc and circle-shaped layout, emerging in the ring of tiny glass skylights, quoting the central churches of the medieval Hungary. The unusual asymmetry of the space with triforium is balanced by the axis of the space row, starting from the baptistry at the entrance to the centurion of the altar apsis. Historic spirit and direct architectural quotation try to find their way. The rooms of silence have been created in the formation of Czech Trappist Cistercian monastery. In the mountains near to Prague, the ruins of a Baroque farm building were reconstructed by the Czech monks returning from France. Following the plans of John Pawson, the U-shaped layout was altered to a closed yard with building wings on all four sides. In this way, modeling the Cistercian monasteries being typical since the Middle Ages. With the rooms of the refectory and dormitory, harmonically adapted building parts have been attached to the beautiful renovated Baroque wing. The sacristy, chapter room, and scriptorium are placed in the new wing. Here we can see the new wings and the old one, a slide before. The chorus of the monks has become the center of the long, narrow church space. The sound of rhythm, the sound of hymns are dissolved in the play of lights within the abstract space created by whitewashed walls. A song in colors gives the most direct image of the building complex designed in the dense urban environment north to Budapest in Hungary. The hierarchic order of the three main functions, church in the middle, vicarage, and community house on your right, results in a liberal composition. The central yard is bordered by building blocks from three sides. The fourth side is opened to the surrounding. The heterogeneous forms of family houses and panel blocks are appeased by the calm composition being open the bay-like formation. Arriving from the small park, the side wing facade, rhythmically articulated with pillars, escorts us, or rather leads us to the church that frontally welcomes us with its monumental elevation. A harmony is born from the delicate sonority of rhythm and scales of openings, while former leanness and consistency hardly gives a chance for emotional attachments. The space of nearly evangelical purity are drawn into a genial and intimate one with the use of wonderful wooden furniture and white structural elements. In the semi-arc apsis of the altar, the glass windows glow with the light of saturated colors, presenting a color-sound transcription of Georgian melody of Kyrie eleison. That's a transcription of the sound in light. I don't know whether that's okay. At the turn of the millennium, the most important need for human race is silence itself. The dynamism of visual world around us has to be changed by the calm environment of the church, where the aesthetic of structure and moderate decoration can provide peaceful surrounding for the meeting with God. The design method concentrating on conceptual elements, which is typical of the young architect generation, gives well-readable answers. The small chapel located in the nature reservation area of Tarnów, Poland, is built in homogeneous materials. All its structure, cladding, and furniture are made of wood. The simplicity of the tiny chapel, referring to the farm building of vernacular architecture, creates a pathetic space. The pattern of a shed is a profane room, but with the presence of the congregation, it becomes a sacred space. The word is completed in Eucharisty. Christ comes to join directly the people. Presently, we live in the era of tradition being fulfilled. The recognized tradition addresses the believers in the contemporary language of forms. They feel at home again in the churches. The goal of our study has been to present these different languages. We consider the self-identification found in historical forms as well as the contemporary way of clear or minimalist architectural formation manifested in abstraction. Are the quotations from vernacular architecture, the forms of classicism, or the engineering aesthetics of modernism the most effective form from the aspect of historical continuity of the Catholic Church? The Catholic churches of the European post-communist countries built on the turn of the millennium represent the reveal of tradition. Thank you very much for your patience.
So I invite all the speakers to the front.
So intensely material.
thank you for the question. It's working. Okay. I do believe that the mass of material is a very important method to design Catholic Church nowadays. So in Europe, it's architects really focus on this kind of problem. It's light structure, like in modernism, is not connected with sacristy, with spiritual spiritual deepness. So I believe that material and the mass of material gives silence in the space, and this is the more important now, I believe.
I actually have a comment related to a question in a way, because the essence of Catholicism and the Christianity is precisely bringing together matter, the material, and the immaterial. So from the mystery of the Eucharist, where the bread and the wine actually do become the blood and body of Christ, while at the same time they preserve their own materiality, this idea of material is actually, I believe, is crucially very down to these cases, particularly in Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. So this is where
But still, there are different ranges in different centuries. So, but if we can take as a turning point the Cistercian architecture, this is one of the aspects. They talk about the material and the light. The very important, the light. And we can see in Gothic, it's really, really important.
I just had a couple of observations that perhaps would provoke comments. Both the Eastern European survey and the Spanish survey obviously have tremendous architectural heritages, and there was some reference to them verbally, but there was no reference visually. It's as if this architecture just sort of happened. I think that's what's interesting to me about that architecture is I don't see where it comes from, despite the words. I would like to see pictures of it, prove it, show me. I'm from Missouri. The second thing that struck me as interesting is why these spaces were so iconoclastic. There was almost no figurative art. I mean, and when there was a figure, you kind of wish it wasn't there because it was so sort of contorted and peculiar looking that it didn't really look like the human body. There's just kind of a barrenness about it. For a religion that Catholicism that has celebrated ornament and beauty and decoration and human figure, to see these buildings that seem so lacking, they struck me as a very odd, phenomenon.
So to follow up on that question, I would actually request Zoran and Esteban to kind of reflect on the sort of the ideas of these architecture, this sacred architecture in Catholic architecture in the 20th century. To what extent did they participate in the discourse of modernity? I mean, to what extent did they participate in the discourses of Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe and others, some of the key proponents of modern architecture? It seems like that's a very valid question, that these architectures did not emerge out of a historic vacuum. They were certainly responding to certain modernist aesthetics and ideologies, and I was wondering if you would reflect on how they sort of participated in the discussions of modernity and modern architecture.
Yeah, it would be nice to show other pictures from historic ages of Hungary and the Eastern Bloc. The real problem is for Hungary and for Czech Republic and Poland is socialism. In that 40 years, we had buildings really decorated in pluralist social realism with nice mosaics and paintings of workers going ahead and to find their way in communism. I think that architects has a fear of decoration now. Maybe it sounds really interesting for you here in America, but architects from the eastern side of Europe are afraid of giving decoration. We have to cut it out when entering a building, a church. Not to have so many pictures, not to have so many images, just only the main elements of the church. Somehow to refer back to the Cistercian architecture.
It's directly to that point. Is that in reaction to social realism that the communists portrayed?
To social realism and the war of picture today. So there are tremendous images we have in our mind, the propaganda, not only the socialist propaganda, the communist propaganda we had for 40 years, giving the images of nice life, but nowadays we have the same from the advertisements too.
Yes. Well, I apologize. We can speak in English, and Anna will speak for us. But it's this moment. Las cuestiones que ha planteado nos parece son las cuestiones clave del debate entre arquitectura clásica y arquitectura moderna.
He thinks that the points that you made were the key points between the relationship between modern architecture and the classic architecture. And Gothic, yeah.
Yeah. Traditional and modern architecture. Lo que nosotros queríamos mostrar, hemos mostrado parcialmente, son los intentos registrados en España durante el siglo XX, durante la segunda mitad del siglo XX, que trataban de responder a esta cuestión.
He showed a couple of examples of the intentions behind some of the people that tried to answer to that kind of problem, the relationship between sacred architecture and the classic architecture and the modern architecture. They could only show a few examples, but that's what they were trying to do.
Nosotros hemos detectado en los documentos de la Iglesia un afán no por repetir los esquemas del pasado, repetir acríticamente los ejemplos del pasado, sino por un cierto diálogo con el hombre de cada momento, con el hombre moderno, con el hombre del siglo XX.
What they were trying to do, looking into sacred scriptures and doing some research in that aspect, was to find, they found that they didn't want to do the same cookie cutter stuff that they did before. They wanted to think about the problem and actually approach it in a different way. So they were interested in that dialogue between what is modernity and in the 20th century and the latest part of the 20th century. They were looking and they were interested in that dialogue between what's going on today and what happened before us and that sort of relationship.
Sorry. Esto en cuanto al diálogo entre la arquitectura tradicional, clásica, gótica, etcétera, y moderna. Y en cuanto a la imagen, en cuanto al iconismo, se me ocurre decir que en una época como esta, en la que hay una saturación de la imagen, en la que recibimos continuamente, estamos saturados de imágenes,
What, what he was trying to say was they were not interested in the iconic architecture. I think the world lately is saturated with images and images and this type of this is this, this is this, this is this, and all these images getting stuck in your head. So they were trying to say that maybe the answer is silence. Maybe want to be in the background and not be exactly in you know.
Michael, in your paper, you sort of articulated that Venetian architecture, in a way, to sort of embody the pluralism that emerged in the wake of the Reformation, and so then moved back to Gothic French. And I was wondering, in 16th century Venice, how did Renaissance figure in their imagination? I mean, in their backyard, in the backyard of Venice, Brunelleschi to Alberti, many other Renaissance masters were dishing out all these major theories. And I was wondering to what extent Calvinist architects reached to the Renaissance ideologies in a way to sort of embody the pluralism that emerged in 16th century Europe.
Go at that in a couple short ways. First, Venice had the benefit of being a very wealthy city and was sort of the archetypal mercantilist. It had a representative government, yet it was very much dictated by a patrician class and by a mercantile middle class. So it literally reached out at that time all over the world. It had very strong rapport with Eastern Mediterranean, with Arab countries, Egypt, with the Byzantine Empire. It actually, at points, traded in as far as Russia and Black Sea, and was actually moving out towards Spain and even into the Atlantic because it had extensive trade to Northern Europe and Flanders. So it was seen as a model, certainly for mercantile, middle class, sort of the modern world. It was technologically, being a maritime state, it was always looking for new methods and means of doing things. Objectively, Venice was a relative latecomer to the Renaissance. It actually hung on to many Gothic forms to relatively late on. So that in a sense, Palladio, specifically, we think of him as Venetian, or certainly as in Vicenza and the Venetian territories. He made this wonderful simplification of forms. The forms that you saw here, that Pietro Lombardo brought, were really Tuscan forms at the end of the 15th century. But the Venetians were relatively slow in adopting them. In a sense, they kind of jumped to a simplified, their own homegrown version was this wonderfully simplified classic form. And I want to make a comment on that. Scamozzi makes it quite well in his books. He actually is, I think, the first architect to say, well, okay, there's an economic basis to all construction. And there's a cheaper way of doing things and there's a more expensive. Now, being Venetians, they did an awful lot of speculative building. So they were looking for very straightforward, simple ways of doing things. And obviously this was highly attractive to a Northern European mercantilist mindset, which had much more in common with Venice than it did with, say, a more a design tradition that was geared towards sort of the beauty and creating the great Gothic cathedrals and serving God. This was more towards serving men. And Venice became precisely their economic approach to things, their simplification, and also a theology that in many ways is also simplified. I mean, Calvin was highly attractive to the mercantile middle class. So I think what you had is this interesting intersection of architectural design, economics, and religion, and it was being consolidated into a new form by Jacques Perret, among others. I mean, there's actually a kind of a small constellation of architect engineers in France that are all following this kind of pattern. What's interesting is, parenthetically, many of them shared the same publisher in Frankfurt, Germany, who was the one who was able to create these beautiful plates and books. So there was a point of encounter, and it extended not just to France, but to the Low Countries and England and the rest. So Venice is a latecomer. Venetian Renaissance architecture is exemplified by Palladio as a highly simplified form, very,
dollars and cents oriented, and that was very attractive.
Okay. Okay. All right. So we ran out of time, but please give a big round of